Thank you very much, Susie. And it is a pleasure for me to be here this evening. I was intrigued when I received the letter from Susie inviting me to come here and speak in this Science on Screen program. I'd never done sort of a talk screen duet before, so I said yes. And I don't get up to Bellingham very often, but because I'm here and you're here, I decided that I had so much to talk to you about that I took about 2.5 talks and I smashed them all together and took the highlights of each, and that's what I'm going to be presenting to you this evening. I will say it struck me as people were coming in and choosing their seat. You're probably seated to get the best view of the movie. It's either that or you're Episcopalians, because they never sit in the front pews. But either way, I have a microphone, and as long as you can hear me, we're good for this evening. So as I said, I have 3 talks really to present tonight, so I'd better get moving. And they are really, they kind of represent the trajectory of my own career, because talking about polar research, that was my expertise. That was what I spent my entire career on. But you'll see how that naturally led me into discussing and communicating on global scale climate change. And then, as Susie mentioned in the introduction, now that I'm retired and I escaped DC with my skin still intact, I'm still very involved in the local scale, because I'm definitely of the opinion that the solutions and the actions that we decide to take at the local scale are going to have at least as much impact as anything coming out of DC. So I'm going to cover all those topics tonight, and maybe in the end you'll understand sort of the subtitle of how I came to love Bigfoot. So let me get started. Now, taking this picture from my family photo album, I could claim that I was destined at an early age to become a glaciologist, that I was just fascinated with snow. However, that's not the case. In fact, this picture shows a more typical interaction I had at an early age with snow. My mother told me that I didn't like being cold, I didn't like snow. So it was quite unusual that she found me choosing glaciology as a career and spending my field time in the high latitudes, north and south. Even when I was a teenager, and that's me in the center of this picture with my mother on the one side and my younger brother on the other side, that was about 16, 17 years later at Athabasca Glacier. I suspect, that's not too far from here, so I expect a lot of you know where Athabasca Glacier is in Banff National Park in the Canadian Rockies. But if you could see my expression, I'm still not too thrilled with glaciology, even as a teenager. The irony in this picture is that years later, when I was a grad student at the University of Washington, my thesis advisor, Charlie Raymond, and I sort of put together our timetables. And when this picture was taken, he actually was studying the Athabasca Glacier at that same moment. So it was really perhaps fate that he and I came together, and he came to be my thesis advisor. But finally, it finally dawned on me that glaciology was kind of interesting. And I liked mountains with snow and ice, and that's really what led me into glaciology. And so the 30 years I've spent doing Antarctic field work has actually felt joyful for me. I mean, it's been a fantastic career. I feel humbled, actually, to have had the privilege and the opportunity to be places on this planet where nobody has ever been before, to be able to research and answer questions that nobody had ever been able to answer before about the behavior of the ice sheets. So it has been a fabulous career, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. And if there is one thing I would tell you about ice sheets that I thought you probably don't fully appreciate, is just their size. I mean, the ice sheets are huge. Antarctica is a continent. And it's not the smallest of the 7 continents. It's the 4th largest continent on the planet. And there's so much ice in Antarctica that most of the fresh water on the planet occurs in the form of ice. And 70% of that, in fact, is ice. And 90% of that ice is locked up in the Antarctic ice sheet. That's how much ice is there. And you can see in the upper left how the size of Antarctica compared to the United States. It's larger than the United States, even when you toss in Alaska. So Antarctica is the big one. The Greenland ice sheet is the other big ice sheet we have, and it holds about 9%. Antarctica, 90% of the ice. Greenland, 9%. So that takes up 99%. There isn't much left. So what we see on Mount Baker, what we see in the Cascades is small glaciers, and what we know about glaciers in the Andes and the Himalayas and the Alps, small ice caps in Canada. That just makes up 1% of the ice on the planet. Most of it's in the big ice sheets. Now, it turns out that's important because if you take that much ice and you put it into the ocean, you will raise sea level 200 feet. That's a lot. What that means is that you can get a fairly substantial change in sea level without changing the ice sheets that much at all. In fact, if you take just 1.5% of the ice that's locked up in ice sheets right now, you will raise sea level 1 meter, about 3 feet, sort of from the ground up to my waist. And the reason I show this global map is that all those red areas have elevations within 1 meter of present sea level. So all those red areas will be flooded if sea level just goes up 1 meter. And the best scientific projections are that will happen by the end of this century. So we're talking about over 100 million people live in those red areas. So we're talking about Bangladesh, Irrawaddy Delta, New Orleans, in southern Louisiana, a lot of southern Florida. Those areas are very vulnerable to increases in sea level. And that's a major sort of part of my story tonight. So sea level rise is a big deal. And because of the economic impacts and how fast sea level rises is the most important sort of characteristic that we're trying to nail down from the scientific community. Because if sea level goes up fast, we don't have that much time to respond to it. And so it's not just this picture in the upper left is from the Maldives, one of the island nations in the Indian Ocean. And the average elevation of the Maldives is right around 11 feet. So they're very low elevation island nation. In fact, they're looking to buy enough land that they can move the entire nation to some place that's less vulnerable to sea level. They know in a century or two they will not have those islands above sea level. They'll be below sea level. But it's not just these island nations. The picture in the lower left, you probably recognize the lower part of Manhattan Island. And this is how high the water got during Superstorm Sandy. And the reason that was significant is that if sea level hadn't risen sort of the foot and a half that it had during the previous 100 years, Superstorm Sandy would have been about $500 million less impactful. The cost of that, the damage caused by Superstorm Sandy, got higher and higher the higher sea level is. And as sea level continues to rise, we're just going to see more and more of that scenario play out, not just in the island nations, but right here on the coastal areas of the U.S. So I'm showing you two plots here, and without any labels, because I want you to convince yourself that they're pretty much exactly the same sort of squiggly line. Those two squiggly lines actually are fairly extensive time series of two very different things. So here are the labels. The one on the top is sea level, and the one on the bottom is temperature. I won't go into how we got all this information, but it's 400,000 years of history, how the temperature, the average global temperature of the Earth has gone up and down and up and down. These are the ice ages and the interglacials between the ice ages. And then on the upper plot, sea level went up and down and up and down and up and down. Temperature didn't change that much, just a few degrees. That's in Celsius. You can multiply that by about 2.5 to get Fahrenheit change. But sea level, that went up and down a lot. That's 120 meters going up and down. So huge changes as the big ice sheets, the ice sheet that used to cover Bellingham with somewhere between half a mile and a mile of ice, covered all of Canada. those big ice sheets, as they came and went during these ice ages, raised and lowered sea level. So the fact that temperature and sea level are linked has everything to do with ice sheets, because it's ice sheets that is either the reservoir that lower sea level. Where'd that water go? It went into the ice. And as the ice sheets shrank, where did that ice go? Well, it went into the oceans and sea level went up. And what caused the ice sheets to shrink and grow? Well, that's temperature. That's why ice sheets represent the link between temperature and sea level. And so what are the ice sheets doing right now? That's what we spend a lot of time trying to measure, and measure very accurately. Because again, just a 1% change in the volume of the ice is a big deal when it comes to sea level change. And what all these colored boxes are individual scientific papers that tried to quantify what we call the mass balance of the ice sheet is, which is essentially a number as if it's a positive number, the ice sheet's growing, the mass is increasing. If it's a negative number, the ice sheet is shrinking. And all these numbers turn out to be either 0 or negative. And this is time along the horizontal axis from a few years ago, a few decades ago to now. So for both Antarctica and Greenland, the mass balance is getting more and more negative. Those two ice sheets are shrinking faster and faster and faster. That's why those arrows go plunging downward. Sea level does just the opposite. It sort of curves upward as a result of that. And the rate at which the ice sheets are losing mass are increasing. That's sort of the big message from the glaciological community. I want to go into a little bit of a discussion about why the ice sheets are shrinking. We know temperature is involved because we have that 400,000 year record, and actually it goes back 1 million years now, that every time the planet has warmed up, sea level's gone up. And the only way it can go up as much as it has is through shrinking ice sheets. So we know the ice sheets are that link. But I'm going to give you four different ways that the ice sheets are losing mass. The first one is just increased surface melt. We see this throughout most of the Greenland ice sheet. But also in Greenland, something else is happening that causes the ice sheet to lose mass, that the actual flow of the ice at the edges increases during the summertime. So that loses mass. That's a process that will shrink the ice sheet as well. If we go to the Antarctic, along the Antarctic Peninsula, the big ice shelves that kind of hold back the glaciers, they're fed by snow falling on glaciers, and then those glaciers flow into the ocean, and they bring so much ice so fast the ocean can't melt it rapidly enough. And so you form one of these thick floating plates of ice. It can be 500 feet thick. And we call them ice shelves. They're actually floating. But these ice shelves are breaking up really fast. And that causes the glacier to accelerate behind it. And then the fourth one is just around a lot of spots around the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheet where these big outlet glaciers funnel a lot of the ice together into valleys and then out into the ocean. They are, where they flow into the ocean, that point, we call it the grounding line, becomes ungrounded, starts to float. That's retreating upstream. The ice is thinning as it's trying to put more and more ice out, and it's accelerating because it's trying to put more and more ice out. We see this signature again and again and again. Now, this is sort of the end of that first talk. and I lead the audience through a more careful description of all of these processes, and then I ask them why. I mean, there's one single, actually the name of the talk is What Ice Sheets Hate. Because there's one sort of active agent that's responsible for those 4 different behaviors, all leading to loss of ice. And I'm going to give you the opportunity to see if you can come up with the one-word answer to that question. What do ice sheets hate? What tears them apart through all those different processes? Oh, the kids are never. Yeah, what do you say? Shout it out. Fire? Well, it's not too far away. Yeah. Sun? In a sense, yeah, but there's even a better answer. All the kids are really into this. Adults, wake up. Yeah. Yeah. That's getting closer. Yeah, the blonde girl? Lightning. Oh, no, you're getting colder now. Now, we got, and anybody else want to take a shot at it? Okay. Pollution's getting close. I saw an adult with a hand up. Yeah? That's even closer. You're getting really warm now. You're getting really close. Put ice and heat together. What do you got? Water. Ice sheets hate water. I think that is just so weird that ice sheets are made of water, right? But if you want to tear an ice sheet apart, you give me water and I can do any one of those four things to it. And let me just run through quickly how that works. So this is so here are those four observations, processes happening right now that are reducing the size of the ice sheets, and then sort of what the way in which water is acting on those ice sheets to reduce their size. So first one is as a solar absorber. So once you start melting the surface of an ice sheet and you get water, water is a darker surface than that bright ice. So it absorbs more solar radiation and warms up more because it's not reflecting as much away. And you will absorb more solar radiation. That energy causes more ice to melt. So it's a self-reinforcing, what we call positive feedback process. So that's one way. Water also acts as a lubricant, because what happens to that water? Well, on the Greenland ice sheet, it actually finds cracks and holes to flow into the ice sheet. It doesn't just flow off the surface. It flows into the ice sheet. Those are actually people in that picture in the back, in the upper right. And these holes get really big because the water starts to melt the ice more and more. So you get bigger and bigger holes. And it keeps going all the way down through the ice. And it actually lubricates the base of the ice. And it's the friction of the ice against the bedrock that controls how fast the ice flows into the ocean. So if you can lubricate that, start greasing that interface, the ice will flow faster. That also causes more mass loss. This one's kind of tricky. Now, if we go to the Antarctic Peninsula, there's a series of two sets of satellite images there that show these ice shelves disintegrating. And the one in the sort of on the left side, that's a series of satellite images over just 6 weeks. And what has happened during the summer is we get a lot of surface meltwater again, and the slope of those ice shelves is so shallow it generally doesn't flow out. It fills up these crevasses that are in the ice. And because water is more dense than ice, what happens right at the base of these crevasses, right at that tip, right at the bottom, if you have the water filling up the crevasse all the way to the top, water is more dense and it opens up that crack. And the ice is trying to squeeze it shut, but water is heavier, more dense, and it opens it up. It goes all the way through. So you just cut this 200-meter thick ice shelf all the way through. Everywhere there's a crack that's filled up with water. And what's happened in this series, you see sort of I'll start with that's the last one. That's the first one with these pools of water, and they're wedging their way down. Then that's the last one. It's essentially sliced up the ice sheet into a bunch of sort of dominoes standing on their ends, and they don't want to sit in the water that way. They want to flop over. So they push their neighbor over. And it looks like the ice shelf just explodes out into the ocean, and it turns this funny shade of blue, which is the color of ice on the inside of the ice shelf. So, and that just happened in 6 weeks. This big ice shelf, the size of France, just disappeared, just disintegrated. It takes tens of thousands of years to form these. So that's water acting as a wedge. I probably spent too much time on that one. And then it gets back to just the fact that even cold water, if you're an ice sheet, that water feels hot. And it carries some heat, and that heat will melt the ice. And in this case, this is warm water getting up underneath these floating ice shelves. They don't disintegrate the ice shelf, but they thin it, and the result is the same, that the glacier that's being held back by this ice shelf can flow faster into the ocean. So it's all these different ways that water is the culprit here. And if I'd had more time, we'd have a cute little skit up here, and we'd act it all out, and we'd have a good time with that, but we don't have it. Don't have time tonight. Ask me back. We'll do it. I love doing the skit. I had Al Gore in the skit. I also had Ted Turner do the skit. So And I've had kindergarten kids do this yet, so it's good for all ages. But sorry, no time tonight. Let's move on. So what are scientists trying to do? Why do we want to reach this understanding? It's because we want to project accurately how sea level is going to change in the future. I said it's a big deal, and I said it's a really big deal if it happens quickly. So how much is sea level going to go up, and how fast is it going to go up? That's what we're trying to put accurate numbers to in my field of research, what used to be my field of research. So this is just a record of how sea level has gradually increased, especially starting in about 1850, but how it's accelerating because the ice sheets are shrinking faster and faster. And that's why this 1 meter is a pretty conservative estimate of where global sea level will be at the end of this century. So, but this is just one piece of this whole global climate science issue. So let me see where I am. Okay, in time. I've got to accelerate myself. Let me just keep going. Communicating this. I want to talk a little bit about communicating science because I've wrestled with this one for the last 20 years. I think this issue has turned my hair gray. You know, that's me. That's actually briefing Al Gore when he was vice president, and then later giving some additional testimony on Capitol Hill a number of 10 years later, which is only 10 years ago. Boy, it sure feels a lot longer than that. But communicating this, Al Gore actually is a science wonk. He loved this stuff. But you are all well aware of how intense this debate has been about climate change. And you're probably all aware of how convinced the experts, the climate scientists are in the reality of all that we're saying. So really what we have, and I think we have to admit it in the science community, we have a failure to effectively communicate this. So this is appropriate for the Pickford Film Center, isn't it? And I've thought about why that is. I have three main reasons I think it has been so hard. One is we can't see greenhouse gases. We can't see CO2 spewing out the tailpipes of cars. We can't see it around. I'm actually going to show you some of it from a satellite view. And we also can't feel climate. What we feel, what we remember, what we experience is weather. And that's not the same as climate. Climate is sort of an average of a lot of weather. But the things that we remember in our own experience are weather events, not climate. Nobody's going to feel a 1 degree warming in climate because it takes 20 years for that to play out. But you'll remember the big snowstorm last year, you know, that kind of thing. And then there's also this, sort of, the message is a hard one to deliver and get people to accept because often it comes across as you want me to change what I'm comfortable doing right now. And there is a natural resistance to change. I think these are sort of three of the main reasons it has been difficult to communicate. So I've boiled down this issue and boiled it down, and this is what I get. It's CO2, it's us. It's dangerous, and it's happening now. That's sort of my message, and if you can remember that sort of mantra, I would be very happy. So I want to kind of defend those statements. It's CO2. The greenhouse effect is not a theory. It's fact, and here we have some more squiggly lines, but this time we have temperature as one of those squiggly lines. Now we're going 800,000 years back. And the other one is carbon dioxide. This is from Antarctic ice cores, and it shows that those two things are in lockstep with each other. So we know every time that global temperature has been high, CO2 content has been high. And every time it's been low, the global temperature has been low. You see in the far upper right where we are right now. And there is one, we'll get to the animation in a moment. So we know CO2 and temperature are very together. And we know that CO2 is going off the charts there. And so we know temperature is going to follow that. There's just no doubt about that. So it's sort of unequivocal. And we know that humans are producing a lot of carbon dioxide. However, humans are not producing anywhere near as much carbon dioxide as natural systems are. But natural systems are absorbing all of that production and even more. And here are the numbers. Well, they're in the chart below, but humans are producing about 29 gigatons of carbon per year. We know that number really well because we measure it carefully when we extract oil and gas out of the earth and sell it and sell it and sell it and use it. So that number is very well known. But humans really aren't doing much of anything to reabsorb any of that carbon dioxide, to put it back into these deep reservoirs from which we extracted it. What nature is doing is actually producing quite a bit more, but through primarily biological activity, plant activity, we're absorbing an enormous amount as well, even more than what natural systems produce. So it's already absorbing part of what humans are producing, but not all of what humans are producing. So there is a net excess of about 12 gigatons of carbon per year. That's what we expect to see, and that's what we do see. Let me show you. I had a fuller animation, but again, this is one of the things I had to sacrifice for time. But I think it's worth looking at. We'll start from a clean slate at the beginning of 2011, and for 1 year, I just have 4 slides here to show you satellite instruments data of the carbon dioxide produced from burning the fossil fuels. It has a particular chemical signature that's different than naturally produced CO2, so we can track it. And this is just after the first of the year. This is 3 months later, and you can start to see where it's coming from. No big surprise that it's coming from East Asia primarily. This is 6 months later, and it's already starting to spread out across the northern hemisphere, but we see that the eastern U.S., a little bit of L.A. is showing up, L.A., San Francisco, and Europe is showing up. China is still in there and big time. This is 9 months later, so it's spread out more. It hasn't gone down to the southern hemisphere very much. And then this is 12 months later. So no big surprise, but this just hopefully indicates to you that, we can see this happening from satellite sensors. Here's the animation that I do want to show, because it gives you some idea of this. Can I get this big enough? Yeah. So this is probably the most important record of all. And this is from the Mauna Loa Observatory. And this is the Earth breathing carbon dioxide. Every spring and summer, as plants grow, it absorbs more carbon dioxide, and the global amount goes down. Every fall and winter, when those plants die, carbon dioxide goes back up. And so it takes a breath once a year. But that extra 12 gigatons of carbon per year, that's that rise. That's why we keep going up, and we're well above 400 now. Now we're going to put this in context. We're going to go backwards in time. We're going to stitch in some other data sets, and we're going to go back thousands of years, just to give you a sense of where we are relative to where we have been. Now we're back to almost the beginning of the Common Era here. So we have, again, and you'll see kind of the envelope within the sort of the natural cycles of ice ages and interglacials and carbon dioxide rising and falling, ice sheets growing and shrinking. There was this natural envelope that we were in for all this hundreds of thousands of years. So I hope that puts that one plot in context of all this other data. A lot of data went into this, you can see. So let me get back to the talk here. Find the right button to push. So that was the final frame in that slide. So we know we are the cause of that large increase, and we know it's going to cause temperatures to increase. I'm getting a little bit short on time. This is just, again, sort of a few frames of an animation that I have. You've probably seen this kind of thing before. It just takes about 60 years of data, globally distributed data to show that the warming of the planet is not evenly distributed. Actually, there are places in the ocean that are getting cooler. That has to do with sort of deep convection cells in the ocean. But it's the northern latitudes. It's those places where the CO2 was spewing out in that other set of frames that I showed. The Arctic is definitely warming more than the rest of the planet, and it's the continents more than the ocean. So again, these are pretty fundamental data sets to the whole case being made by climate scientists of what's going on. The thing I think that has irritated me most about those people promoting the climate change as a hoax, or there's still too much science debate and too much debate going on in the science community. What's irritated me the most is this issue of we can't afford to respond to this crisis. We can't afford not to respond to the crisis. There is money to be made. I hear it from economists and capitalists all the time, and it's dangerous not to respond. I talked a lot about rising sea level, but that's not the thing that actually worries me the most. Ocean acidification, I think, is a far more urgent problem. Rising sea level is going to take a few decades to unfold. I think we can adapt to that if we're smart enough and aggressive enough. Ocean acidification, half the world's population depends on the ocean as their food source. And even in the Pacific Northwest, I mean, shellfish industries are already starting to feel the effects of ocean acidification. But that's not even the one that really keeps me up at night. The last one, this more frequent extreme weather events, that's literally the killer in here. And that's the one that's going to hurt us economically, morally, ethically, the most. Through all these extremes, the droughts, the storm surges, the intense precipitation, and the extreme temperature changes. And you only need to watch the news every night to sort of see this unfolding right in front of your eyes. It's happening. There's lots of documentation now that says that the frequency of extreme weather events is well beyond just sort of random statistics. So that's the one that keeps me up at night. It's now, that the fourth sort of verse of that mantra. This is a report much like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but this was for the U.S. in particular. And I just took some statements from it and underlined some of the types of events that it's talking about. In all cases, they're talking about these extreme weather events happening more and more frequently. It's happening right now. And then the final statement at the bottom: human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being the most dominant one, or the dominant cause of the observed warming. No caveats on that whatsoever. But I want to take a few minutes to explain why that should be the case, because that's just a scientist talking to you, and you can accept it or not if you trust the person. If you think it's good information or not, you may hear just the opposite from somewhere else. I want to take a stab at trying to convince you why that would be the case. Because what we absolutely know unequivocally is that CO2 is going up. That's going to warm the planet. We measure the warming on the planet. Why would that cause more frequent extreme weather events? Because then you have to go to these complicated models, and they throw numbers all over the place, and they crunch for months and months and months and spit out data. But you don't have to believe all that. You don't have to trust all that. The first answer that this has to be the case is that heat is energy. And if you have a system with more energy, and that the climate system sort of expresses the energy and the chaos within it through weather, you're going to heat that up. It's going to be more energetic. You have to have more frequent extreme weather events. If models didn't come up with that result, I wouldn't trust them at all. It has to be that way. And I guess it's a metaphor that I would use here, is think about Halloween night, okay? The kids come back with a bag full of candy. That's energy, and they want to eat it all. So they get a big shot of energy. They're going to have some extreme weather events too. And it's similar. You know, they've got more energy, and it's going to be more chaotic. Has to be. It makes sense. It just hopefully that appeals to your common sense. The other answer I'll give is a little bit more complicated. So let me explain that. And this has to do with the fact that the global weather exists as sort of these zonal bands of easterlies, the westerlies. We know our weather comes from the west and comes across the Pacific. We can see it coming, and that's because we're in the westerlies. In the tropics, it's just the opposite. It comes the other way. And that's why is that? Why does it go around these latitudinal bands? It's because the tropics are warm, the polar regions are cold, and that temperature difference drives these systems around, and we have to, for every westerly, we have to have an easterly to sort of balance the vorticity on the planet. So that's sort of the natural system. But I showed you in that plot that had the globe and had the Arctic warming more than the tropics. Because of that, this temperature difference between the cold Arctic and the warm tropics is less extreme than it has been in the past. And it's that difference in temperature that makes this zonal wind so strong. So if you decrease the difference between the temperature in the Arctic and the tropics, it won't be quite as strong. And so that jet stream that likes to meander back and forth can meander more. And so it can go a little bit higher latitude and go a little bit more southerly latitude than it had before. And that's what's causing these things that are labeled the polar vortex now, that it's steering these deviations in the jet stream. And they can be more extreme now because the Arctic is warming faster than the tropics. So, and that's part of the extreme weather that we experience. So it makes perfect sense that in climate change and even in what's been labeled global warming, that we would have extreme snowstorms. That's consistent with our understanding of how the weather is changing as a result of those forces. Okay, a little bit more. I have to get to Taming Bigfoot. So I retired, escaped DC, came out to the Olympic Peninsula, and I got involved in more local activities there. Actually, the group that I'm a part of is called the Climate Action Outreach Group in Jefferson County. They have a pretty aggressive goal of reducing carbon emissions 80% by the middle of this century. And I gave the climate talk and the doom and gloom talk, and we had the reasons for hope talk and all that stuff. And then we got back together and said, okay, what do we do next? Well, I kind of wanted to talk about the economics, but we didn't have an economist that was prepared to give that talk. So we said, well, our audience out there is saying, okay, we get the science, we understand that, but we're asking ourselves, what can we do? What should we do? And how do we know what we do actually makes a difference? And it was on that basis that we put together something called Taming Bigfoot. And what Taming Bigfoot is a competition. People form teams, and as a team, they compete against other teams to try to reduce their carbon footprint the most and win prizes from businesses that sponsor this competition. And we have it endorsed by the Port Townsend City Council and the county commissioners. They said this is a great idea, go do it. And, that it matches our goal of what we want to achieve. And it turned out to be a huge success. I mean, these were our goals. First of all, education. So we wanted people through their own experience in trying to reduce their carbon footprint to learn what the relative benefits were of, say, turning down their thermostat 2 degrees versus starting to carpool or driving, so doing lumping their errands together so they drive less. What are the real quantifiable benefits of one versus the other? Or not taking an airplane flight, or buying more locally produced food. And through their own experience, they learn this a whole lot better than somebody standing with a mic in their hand and telling them what they should do. And they can strategize with their teammates, and they can share experiences. And so learning the relative effectiveness, I think, was one of our primary goals. Working with teammates, so it's not you against the world, but you actually are cooperating with others. We built community through this because the businesses supported it, the city council and the commissioners and the residents all were working together because this is a common good to reduce carbon emissions. Everybody benefits from that. I think I have on there, yeah, we're all hitched to the same wagon. And so reduce the finger pointing. You know, it's the pulp mill over there. You know, if only they would do it, then we'd all be fine. No, everybody has a role to play in this. And to have fun. I've discouraged too many audiences. You know, had seen long faces. You know, leave the auditorium. This was a very uplifting and fun activity. I just came back from Edmonds last night. They had their celebration after they ran Taming Bigfoot, and they were having so much fun. They had written, some teams had written songs, others had written limericks and poems, and they were just laughing and having a good time. And they learned in the process. But ultimately, it does have this effect of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So Taming Bigfoot was this surprisingly huge success. And at the heart of the competition is having a carbon footprint calculator that's actually customized to your local place. We worked very hard on that in Jefferson County to make sure that the carbon emissions associated with every kilowatt hour of electricity was the right number. It's not some nationally average number. That had a lot of benefit to it. And we looked at the home energy sector, and we also looked at the transportation sector and food and shopping separately, so you could identify sort of where the largest sectors were of your individual footprint. Now it's a smartphone app. You can go to the Google Play Store, or you can go to the iOS, whatever, the Apple Store, and you can punch in Taming Bigfoot, and you can download this smartphone app. We had a couple of software developers develop this for us. And I've run over. I won't show all of this, but all the teams for 1 month, you know, they just do their own thing. They don't change their behavior, so we can get a good baseline for each individual team, because everybody had a different starting point. And this was just a way of showing we had 13 different teams in Jefferson County when we ran it. And so where you were right or left determined indicated where your home sector footprint was, and up and down was the transportation. How big that bubble was how big your food and shopping footprint was, and what color it was your overall footprint. So it was sort of engaging to see where your team was relative to some other team for the starting point. And then we went through 2 months of trying to reduce their footprint and collecting the data to do that. Not a lot of data needed to be collected. And then we'd come back together and we'd show them how the bubbles moved and grew or shrank and changed color. So it was really quite engaging to show the results in this way. And there are other ways to show it. Edmonds did it a different way. And we learned a lot. I won't go into all the lessons that were learned. If you want to ask me questions about it, I'm happy to come back. And the best news was we actually did reduce the carbon emissions, about 10%. And it turned out to be about 30.5 tons over the 2 months that the teams were attempting to reduce their footprint. So it actually does have a measurable impact. And now we have a baseline and some data to work with to see how this changes over time. In fact, a year later, a number of the participants collected another set of data. And some had backslid, some hadn't, and that's just how it goes. Yeah, so I won't go to setting Bigfoot loose. Once I started to talk about our success, Edmonds picked this up, and as I said, they just concluded their competition, and they had a great time with it. It was clear from their awards ceremony. Seattle is wrapping up this month their competition, and I'm sure they're going to have the same experience. I'm kind of challenged, you know, laying down the gauntlet here in Bellingham. I think you would have a heck of a good time if you got organizers together and did this. We in Jefferson County helped Edmonds and Seattle sort of learn the ropes and get going on this. And we'll do that with any community that wants to undertake Taming Bigfoot. I'm wearing the official Taming Bigfoot button here, which Edmonds didn't go for because it wasn't compostable, but I get it. The students in Seattle took that on. So it's fun. I mean, people would just get their own ideas as to how to contribute to this activity. It really is a very, very positive experience for a community. Edmonds had a guy dressed up in a Sasquatch costume, and they would do sort of Sasquatch sightings around town, and be written up in the local paper. He was in the parade on July 4th and things like that, just to build interest. They had fun with it, and they also had about a 10% reduction in their footprint. And nobody was crying uncle. Everybody was laughing and having a good time about it. So in the end, I want to end with a couple of slides here. One is, I'm actually fairly optimistic, but this political cartoon really nails it for me. You know, here's this person in the audience listening to a scientific lecture, and he stands up and says, what if all this climate change stuff really is a big hoax, and we create a better world for nothing? You know, well, you know, think about that. It's a goal worthy in its own right. And speaking to the change, sometimes change can be good. It's not all bad. It shouldn't be felt, you shouldn't feel threatened if somebody's saying that what we're doing on this planet through human behavior is causing a crisis and causing pain and suffering. Change can be good. So in summary, I'll just let you read these. I mean, these are sort of the takeaway messages. I mean, climate change is a crisis, and we are responsible for it. Rising sea level is part of the reason that it's a crisis. And sea level will continue to rise. We're going to have to adapt to it. There's just no question about it. But ocean acidification and more frequent extreme weather events, that's really what worries me the most. And those are perhaps the most dangerous consequences. And there's pain and suffering associated with that right now. Not so much in the U.S., but even there. I mean, it wasn't, the recent storms, Irma, Maria, what were all their names? It's quite a long and lengthening list of dramatic storms that are causing a lot of pain and suffering, and in some cases death. I'm optimistic because we will adapt to climate change, but it's kind of up to us to figure out what level of pain and suffering we're willing to accept on the global scale. So to me, it's not a scientific issue anymore. It's more a moral and an ethical issue. And finally, sustainability is a common good, but we have to avoid this, what's called the tragedy of the commons, that people will abuse a common resource and use it for their own selfish interest and not. I think we have to do a better job of assigning value to these common resources that are the common good. Then I think everything will sort itself out. But we need the willpower to do that. And I think I'll end at that point. And hopefully this relates somehow or other to the movie. I think it does. I asked for a movie that had sort of dealing with a crisis, dealing with natural systems. And I've never seen the movie, so I'm looking forward to it. If you have any questions now, I'll take whatever questions you have for as long as we're allowed to go back and forth before the movie. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, the adult. The question was, am I going to present this to President Trump? I would never want to be in the same room with President Trump unless his ears were open to this message, and I would be there as long as I could keep the doors locked and force him to listen to it. But it disturbs me deeply what is happening in D.C. and what is happening in the current administration, as you might expect. And I talked to my colleagues in NASA and EPA, and they also are deeply disturbed. The really good thing about working at NASA was the loyalty of the workforce and the high morale that agency had. And I hear from the people in NASA and other agencies now the morale is rapidly eroding. That's something that you just can't recover from very quickly. So it troubles me. Now, let me just leave it there. Yes?
When these other cities took on this
Taming.
project, where did it happen through? Did it happen through city government? Did it happen through organizationally?
The question was,
Seattle?
with the Taming Bigfoot, sort of, what group sort of hosted this and organized it? In Jefferson County, it just was the outreach group. It was sort of an independent group that had a common interest in communicating solid scientific information. In Edmonds, it actually was a non-denominational faith group. That was the group that I presented to, and they embraced it and took it on. In Seattle, it was much the same. It was an interdenominational faith group that took it on. So,
All right.
yeah. And actually, if you go to that website, taming-bigfoot.org, there is a guide to how to do taming Bigfoot. We sort of wrote up a quick guide. We're going to do a better job of that, but there's also my email, and you can contact me, and I'll come present. I'll tell you all you need to know. Yes.
As far as, and it might be too complex to get into here, but methane versus CO2, and there's a lot of methane being released in the natural world now.
Yeah.
Actually, I read today that they discovered some on Mars, but that's probably not our doing.
Probably not. Yeah, the question was about methane versus CO2. And you're right, methane is about 20 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. And were there equal amounts of both in the atmosphere or equal amounts being emitted, we would be talking about methane, not carbon dioxide. But the relative amounts of those two gases being emitted, it's much larger numbers for CO2. So even with a 20 times amplifier for methane, the overall impact of the small amount of methane that has a very efficient greenhouse gas effect versus huge amounts of CO2 with a smaller effect per molecule. CO2 is the one we have to worry about the most. But methane is an issue as well. And you're right. I mean, the methane is being released in ever increasing quantities, especially in the Arctic as permafrost thaws. That's so people. There are scientists that worry and warn of methane time bombs in Siberia with the thawing permafrost. A huge amount of methane is likely locked up there. So yeah, there are things there to worry about too. Yes, absolutely. I mean, as I said, that methane is being released through the thawing of permafrost, and the fact that the Arctic is warming up so much more than the global average. The consequence of that is that more and more methane is being released. Yeah, in the back. Yeah, the ice I talked about were the ice sheets. They're the grounded ice sheets. Another part of the cryosphere, we call it, is the sea ice, the thinner veneer of frozen seawater, and that's sea ice. And that's what the icebreakers push through to open up ports and keep transportation lines open. And certainly the amount of sea ice, especially in the Arctic, is shrinking. And it has that same net effect as the water on the surface of an ice sheet. The fact that as you have less sea ice, you have more dark ocean exposed, and that absorbs more solar radiation, and that melts more ice, and that's a very strong positive feedback. In fact, that's probably why that single process is probably the dominant one that's causing the Arctic to warm faster than anywhere else on the planet. Is just that transition of we have less bright reflective sea ice and we have more dark absorbing open ocean up there. And so I'd never heard that sort of icebreakers are sort of in any part responsible for that. I think it's just that positive feedback working in a natural way. Yeah.
From Taming Bigfoot, the efforts, transportation, housing, and food, what are the top actions for each of those areas that you could recommend today?
Well, in Jefferson County, which I was looking at the Edmonds results last night because I know Jefferson County so well. For every single team, the transportation sector was the largest. It was the majority of their footprint for every single team, and and part of that was because you can turn down your thermostat, you can eat local and organic, but if you step on an airplane and fly down to San Francisco, it just overwhelms all those other activities. So one thing that came across in spades is that airline travel is very, very, very carbon intensive. So avoiding that as much as possible is probably the single most important thing you could do in the transportation sector. In home energy, it was interesting contrast between Edmonds and Jefferson County, because Jefferson County gets all of its electricity through the Bonneville Power Authority, and it's 87% hydroelectric power, and 13% nuclear. Edmonds still gets a little bit from coal-fired power plant, coal trip plant in Montana. And so actually the electricity that Edmonds is using is more carbon intensive than Jefferson County. So that's where the regional difference really can be very enlightening. So in Jefferson County, you could turn down if you heat your home through electric means, you can turn down your thermostat and you won't get much of a reduction in your footprint at all. However, if you heat through propane or even wood burning, you would get, but that doesn't translate directly over to Edmonds, because there they could get a reduction in their footprint by turning down their electric heat. So it varies, but that was part of the educational experience. Yeah, and over in Jefferson County, we have a lot of local and organic farming going on. I think you have up here too. Edmonds, not so much. In Seattle, probably, certainly not so much. So it differs from the various regions. Yeah. Yeah, back corner.
If the failure to communicate is a problem, what's the scientific community doing to revise their strategies? Because obviously it hasn't been working.
That's an excellent question. So if the communication is the problem, what's the scientific community been doing to improve their effectiveness? One of the problems is we don't get rewarded for talking to anybody other than our own scientists. And that's a systemic problem. If you're early or mid-career and you want to advance your career, it's how many published peer-reviewed articles you can produce, and how many talks you give at how many scientific meetings. You don't get any benefits professionally at all by talking to an audience of people who are paying your salary. Back when I was civil service, you were paying my salary. And that there are still those who are willing to get out there and speak to politicians as well as general audiences. But it's not a major movement. We still do too much communication through these big, thick documents, 100 pages, and they have impact with some governments, not so much with the U.S. government. I pointed to one document we had here where it's sort of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, their version of the IPCC. That was asked for by the agencies in the government. So all the same scientific information went into that. The same statements were made. The agencies get that report. My more pessimistic days, I say, well, the agency is just doing that because then they can put that document on their shelf and not do anything. It's a problem. I've been working with some scientific committees, and the soapbox that I get on very frequently is we scientists have to have more personal relationships with people in the general public. We can't just be throwing documents over the transom and expect it to have any results. Because ultimately, communication is about trust. And trust requires this personal interaction. So in my ideal world, it would be more scientists actually getting out and having more lectures with and more interactions with people to get the information across in a way that's accessible. Hopefully I've achieved some of that with trying to boil this down, trying to hit common sense, trying to hit your own experiences so it makes more sense and you can trust it more. But there aren't many of us who do it, and I'm retired and I don't have to worry about advancing my career, but it's still such an important thing that I still do it, and there are a few who do it, but not enough. You're right. It's a failing of the science community. I think we have to accept that in our community. There are politicians, but your role in this, I will say that I've given lots of testimony on the Hill, talked to lots of politicians, right and left, center, and they almost always will say the same thing, that, okay, I get your science, you have your credentials, it makes sense to me, but until I hear it from my constituents, I have too many other things on my plate that I know matter to them. So, and whether it's conservative or liberal, they will say essentially that, make that statement. And I think I have to take them at their word. So when people ask me, what should I be doing, I would say there are actions at the local level, so your own behavior, but use your voice with your constituents, with your representatives. They will listen to you. That's where their ear is tuned, to you, not some scientist coming up from the Olympic Peninsula that used to work on the East Coast for 30 years and used to hide out in Antarctica every winter. You matter. You do have a voice, and using it is the best, is one of the best approaches, seriously. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, in the middle and back.
I was just going to ask you if you could speak a little bit about maybe your first time going up to the Antarctic.
Oh, I went down to the Antarctic. Yeah, got to get that straight. But yeah, and then you go upside down, right? I've been both, but the experiences. Big. See, I did my grad work at University of Washington, and we went up to Alaska, variegated glacier outside of Yakutat, and it was a mountain glacier that surged every once in a while, and I kind of got used to that scale. When I did my first Antarctic field work, it was just vast. It was just so enormous. It was hard to really comprehend how we were going to study something so big. And actually, that was one reason we got into satellite data. It gave us a much broader view. It was dry. It was so cold that in Alaska you had to worry about things getting wet, your sleeping bag getting wet, and everything getting wet. And it rained a lot in maritime Alaska. And in Antarctica, I didn't have to deal with any of that. You could flop down on the snow and roll around and get up and brush off, and you would be dry. That was great. Until it got so dry that your lips would crack and you had other problems. It wasn't so much the temperature, it was the wind, and so it's all the whole idea of wind chill was sort of first conceived of by I can't remember the Seipel, Paul Seipel, and that's my wife. See, she's heard me give this all the time. Paul Seipel, Boy Scout that went with Admiral Byrd. And he was down there, and he probably had sort of the same experience. It's not the temperature, it's the wind. So don't tell me what the temperature is, whether it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Is it blowing 10 knots or is it still? And then I know how to dress. And people will stand with their backs to the wind and have conversations sort of like this. We would be talking to each other because the wind is coming from our back, and nobody wants to turn into the wind. Those are some of the things that I learned quickly down there. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
It seems like you're kind of more of a pragmatic approach. They have kind of almost conceded that
I would say Europe is more aware of the crisis than the U.S. in general is, at least in a responsive way. They have far more wind farms there. They are far more aggressive in their regulatory and sort of policy in their acceptance of those policies as a way of addressing the climate change crisis than we are here in the U.S. We are absolutely gridlocked here at the national level for sure. So they're farther along, and as a result, they're making money at it. I mean, Germany and Iceland are selling sort of geothermal and wind farm technology to India. They're making lots of money doing that, and the economic benefits to be realized by doing that, the U.S. is simply losing out. Steve Schneider, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, he was a very good scientific communicator, and he was asked by an NPR reporter on the day that the Kyoto Protocol took effect, that the U.S. wasn't willing to sign. What's going to take for the U.S. to come around? And he said it's not going to have anything to do with the science argument. It's all going to be the economics. As soon as businesses start pounding on the doors of the senators and the representatives in D.C. saying we are losing market share globally by not having regulations that allow us to develop sustainable green power, and you need to change that so we can compete in the global marketplace, that's when it's going to start to change. It will be the almighty dollar that really drives this, I think, at that level. But at the local level, grassroots, it will be the minds of you all, telling your representatives what you care about and how you want what policies you want. And it's important for a scientist not to dictate policy. And some of my colleagues are terrible at that. So I'm a scientist. I communicate what I know about the scientific about the climate system, and then it's up to the public to decide what they want to do about that. To give you the what if scenarios. If this, then that's going to happen. If you do that, then this other thing's going to happen. It's not for the scientists to dictate policy. So I try to keep very clearly on the right side of that boundary. Yeah. In terms of what Steve Schneider suggested was that once businesses start to realize that they can make money if they are provided a level equal incentives to what are being provided by other countries to their power companies, they will be asking for those same sorts of incentives to develop green power. But it hasn't happened yet. The government isn't willing to provide those incentives, and it's quite the opposite. The incentives are to continue with fossil fuels. Yeah.
For those grantees and family members that are willing to engage in this conversation, is there a book or a publication or you could recommend to send along in layman's terms about the issue?
Oh, I don't know. Rather, the question is there something that, for your family and friends, that you would want to enlighten? Is there some resource to go to? I mean, there are. Somebody want to suggest something? You said, have some people used things? I mean, there's various websites. There's I can't remember, Clear Science or Clean Science, something like that has a lot of FAQs. Actually, who they will trust more is you, and then anything that you've written by somebody else that you send them. This video is going to be, I don't know what you're going to do with this video. It's going to be available in some sense. Feel free, but I'll open that up to other people's suggestions as to where they've had success, perhaps in influencing their friends and family. I mean, they trust you more than they trust me. I can guarantee you that. So that's why I try to boil it down to, it's CO2, it's us, it's dangerous, it's now. Did you have a suggestion there in the back? There is a book by Naomi Klein that I found it a little bit over the top myself, but it may be right for some people. I think she's a little bit extreme in some of her statements and a bit too rigid in some of her conclusions of how things will unfold. There is a large, thick book called Drawdown that lists a whole number of different sort of activities and the carbon footprint associated with those footprints. That's quite educational, but it's kind of thick and a little bit. You have to plow through that a little bit. Naomi Klein's book's kind of thick too, but you can Google Richard Alley. He is a fantastic science communicator on climate science issues. Very entertaining guy. He probably has some YouTube clips out there that might prove effective and entertaining. Yeah.
I want to concur with you because it is sometimes it is a bit heavy and it's like, oh, gee. But I think sometimes we just want to hear somebody shoot straight because we hear about us doing stop driving, stop flying, stop doing this. Meanwhile, Russian icebreakers break up the ice and we still have at the gas station where they're like, run off into the streams and all. It's like, so I think you want to hear someone say, we have real problems and this is some of the extremes of it, and just talk real and maybe even go over the top as opposed to tippy-toeing and being all PC about everything and
Yeah.
not getting anything done.
Yeah, I mean, it's different strokes for different folks. I mean, it will put some people off, and it will sort of motivate others. So it depends on the audience. I think you're right. Fair enough. Yeah.
Now, I read one thing about carbon footprint that started out with how many kids you had being the most important thing. The second thing was how big of a house you lived in. And the third thing was transportation. Now, did you start with transportation because people have already had their kids and they already live in a certain size house, and so transportation is the thing you can do the most about, or do you disagree with that?
I wouldn't disagree with it because those are definitely big components of a person's footprint. I think I'm correct in the conclusion of Drawdown, where they looked at some 200 or so different activities that how food is produced and moved around and then consumed is bigger than all of those. But certainly the ones you mentioned, the transportation and how many kids you have and how large your house is, are big ones too. You're right. That's not why we picked those, but well, I guess in a sense it is, and they were easy to measure. I thought everybody would know how to read their electric meter. It wasn't quite right, but they know how much gas they buy. And people are incredibly sensitive to the price of gasoline. A few pennies here and there, it's quite amazing what we're. I want to know what the young adult has to ask. I got to get ready for this one. They ask some tough questions.
So if we were able to use carbon dioxide to heat our houses, would it stop global warming?
Interesting question from the young. If we were able to use carbon dioxide to heat our houses, would it stop global warming? If you can figure out how to heat houses using carbon dioxide, I can almost guarantee you a Nobel Prize. But I mean, there are people who are working very, very hard on trying to figure out beneficial ways to use carbon dioxide to sequester it. And there are lots of ideas that have come up. The problem generally is they don't scale well. They may work fine in a laboratory in a small experiment, but if you try to look at expanding that use and scaling it up to really large scale, it kind of all falls apart. So there aren't too many things that we can do beneficial to sort of human activities with carbon dioxide. That's one of the problems. We don't really have a good use for it, and it's definitely hurting the planet in that sense of having these consequences of acidifying the ocean and the more frequent extreme weather events. So, but people are still trying to work on that one, definitely. Yeah.
I saw a documentary here about some snowboarders did, and I can't remember the name, but it was about the loss of snowboarding activities as a result of climate change. And I thought, and I was really surprised myself, because it seemed like that would be something that would appeal to people who wouldn't know how it turns out in the end.
Huh,
So,
interesting. Yeah. And, well, let me answer that in kind of a left-handed way, and I got the high sign that this will be my last answer. That when it came to trying to get people to accept what scientists were warning about, global warming, climate change, where we found audiences receptive was when we talked about something they were familiar with. So when we talked to ornithologists about it's going to change bird migration routes, they were concerned. They weren't concerned about anything else having to do with climate change, but if it affected those birds that they cared about, it mattered to them. The beekeepers, when it came to how it affected bees, it mattered to them. Surfers, when it changed how the ocean currents were going to be circulating around the earth, and where the diminishing the pleasure that they felt in going to some of these surfing meccas to surf, they cared about. Sailors, wind pattern changes. It was really, that told me a lot, that you have to get your audience, you have to get on the same wavelength as your audience and speak about it in terms that they care about, whether it's birds or bees or wind patterns or ocean currents. And without that, you're just showing slides and entertaining yourself and not really communicating. So I don't know exactly what the surfers were talking about, but that's what that sparks. What it triggers in my mind is that a scientist has to present any of their information on a wavelength and in an arena that the audience cares about. Otherwise, they won't communicate. So hopefully I've done some of that tonight, and I'm going to enjoy the film, and I'll be around afterwards if you have additional questions. But I understand the staff wants to move forward and show Beasts of the Southern Wild. So thank you again for your attention.